I am really extremely honored and happy, even though we would have loved to have Diana Ojeda with us today. She had other engagements which kept her from traveling, but we are so happy that in spite of all that, she could make some time to talk to us about her work via Zoom today. Let me please introduce her to you very quickly. She's a Colombian feminist geographer working at the intersection of feminist political ecology and critical agrarian studies. She is a professor at the Department of Geography at Indiana University in Bloomington in the United States of America, and has published numerous papers on, for example, tourism as an everyday geopolitical project, on Malthus' specter and the Anthropocene, and on feminist ecologies, as well as on peasants and resource politics in the Colombian Caribbean. So we are extremely happy that to learn more about your work today and to get an opportunity to discuss with you today. Welcome Diana Ojeda, even from far away, and yeah, let's maybe welcome her together.
Thank you. Thank you, Cornelia, for the invitation. Thanks also for accommodating for me being able to attend, even if it is online. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you all, thinking about ecofeminism, how it contributes to thinking.
Oh, maybe Diana, just to say hi, you can unshare the screen because actually people can't see you.
Yes,
on the screen.
Okay.
I just realized because I can see you.
No, I'm very big in the screen. Hi, everybody. Thank you again for the invitation. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to being in conversation with you about these topics and offering, hopefully, a Latin American perspective of these issues. So that is the idea of the presentation. Let me share it again. Yes. So the title of the presentation is Poner la vida en el centro, which has become a very important political slogan in Latin America. It is a way in which different struggles around the environment, about what is defined in the Latin American context as the defense of territory, how many of these struggles have come together. And that has been super interesting in the last 2 or 3 decades with the accentuation of extractivism, with a lot of big-scale projects. The more and more Latin American movements and some Caribbean movements as well have been pushing for this idea of putting life at the center and protecting life. And this is not, in the sense of that any life or individual life. The idea of putting life at the center is based on the idea of a collective life that is lived with dignity, but also lived with gusto, like a joyful life and a dignified life. And that is something that I want to explore. I think that speaks a lot to my own research, but also to the Latin American feminisms, and in particular to feminist political ecologies in Latin America. So I wanted to start by sharing a bit of my work. I've been working in the Colombian Caribbean. That is the map that you see there. And the Colombian Caribbean is a region full of history, a history of plantations, so tobacco, rice, cotton, bananas, of course, and more recently, oil palm plantations. Cartagena, one of the main cities in the region, was the most important port where a lot of enslaved people from Africa came to the continent, to the Americas. And it is also a place that has a long, long history with different forms of organization. So you find in the Colombian Caribbean a lot of anarchist communes, a lot of spaces. It is also, a super important place for unionization in the 20th century. And you find also a lot of peasant movements claiming land. And this is the region that I've been doing research for 20 years now. So some of the things that have informed my perspective, my own way of understanding feminist political ecology come from the agrarian question. A lot of it of, the classic idea of following that question of land and power and how to understand who owns land, what for, but also informed by, the classic school, let's say the North American and Anglophone school of feminist political ecology. Thinking a lot about land grabbing to me. So that is also a particular way of entering questions about ecofeminism, because having land and having a question about class, about power, about these large structures, I think is an important part of what ecofeminism has been stripped of. Like the caricature of how people understand ecofeminism comes a lot with essentialism, comes a lot with depoliticizing in many ways, making it an individual thing, depoliticizing it, and stripping it from a history that comes also from the agrarian question and questions about who owns land, who controls natural resources as a whole, water, forests, and that is part of the question. So enclosure, privatization, all of these things are part of it. For me, it is also, and I think this is very much present in Latin American ecofeminisms and feminist political ecologies, is the geopolitics of conservation and climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. But, since we are seen mostly as a site of mitigation, there is a lot of question about colonialism and the long roots that environmentalism has in these colonial forms of domination. There's also, to me, and I think this is probably something that is an important mark of Latin American scholarship, and particularly Colombian, is thinking all the time with political violence and how it connects with imperial formations. I think it is very difficult to carry out research about nature production, about environmental deterioration in places like Colombia without thinking about violence and the different forms of violence. Structural, slow, and political is one that is very important. So violence from all different armed actors, legal and illegal, from the state, I think those are important questions. And for me, thinking with Francia Marquez Mina, who is an environmental defender, Goldman Prize of 2016, and now Vice President of Colombia, for me it is very important to always trace what she calls the imposition of a politics of death. When she speaks about a politics of death, it is about overlapping regimes that attack life, that put social reproduction at risk. So for her, it has to do with racism, with bigger structures of dispossession and inequality. And that idea of overlapping regimes of death, for me, has been very useful when thinking about my different sites of research that I will show you now. One of the things that I have worked on is this idea of green grabbing in relation to ecotourism. What you're seeing is Tayrona National Park. Maybe some of you have visited. It is like an emblematic tourist site in Colombia. An astonishing place because you have the mountains, the snow-top mountain of La Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta, that goes down to the ocean. And one of the things that I found in my research is that the touristification implied a lot of violence, while it was claimed that it was, now safe and that a lot of international tourists could come and visit. What was going on is really a tightening of the paramilitary control of the area. This was in 2005, 2006, 2008. This is also during the right-wing government of Álvaro Uribe Vélez. And a lot of the touristification was done at the expense of fishing communities. So I had the opportunity to think with a lot of fisher women and fishermen who lived in the area and who were displaced, who were taken by force out of the park. Then my research moved to a little bit further, but still in the Caribbean region, to think about the clean development mechanism promoted by the UN as part of climate change mitigation, and how many of the programs of climate change mitigation and carbon offsets really looked like plantations. So timber plantations of teak, among other trees, became very common in the Colombian Caribbean, and oil palm plantations, that is what you see here, were being promoted as biofuels. So I started tracing again, how dispossession happens in the name of nature and what it means on the ground. And again, what I found was a lot of political violence. This is a time, the early 2000s was a time of forced displacement, massacres, selective assassinations, sex violence in the region, and how those were mobilized for grabbing land and putting it in the market for big corporations who have, the traditional, who are owned by the traditional members of the traditional elites, the political and economic elites. And I started always, thinking with feminism in my head. One of the big questions behind both tourism and the implementation of these big plantations was how this was a masculinist project that was very much based on narratives of domination of land and nature, and also how these spaces were poorly managed. They were poorly managed. They were occupied by the wrong kind of people, that they could be put to produce and they could be put to good use if only those lands weren't in the hands of peasants and mainly Black and indigenous groups in the Colombian Caribbean. So that for me was always a question, and how militarization was fundamental to the production of these landscapes. So one of the things that was clear to me was how the regimes of private security of these plantations were connected to paramilitary powers, and they were essential to controlling land and water. The other thing was labor, which was, the plantations mostly hire Black men, some of them young men. They have super precarious conditions, but then the women who are working at the plantation do it without even being hired, without a contract. They are gleaners because they pick up the fruits that are left behind when the men cut the fruits that you see here being transported. And they were doing it without any pay. So to me, that was one question, like, why are you doing this without any pay? And it's because they were helping the men. They were required to help their partners, their brothers, their fathers. And to me, that immediately, again, having the feminist perspective immediately called my attention, like living at the margins of a plantation and what it implies in terms of the roles of, more than gender roles, the work that gender does in order to articulate and to, more than articulate, assemble these landscapes that we see. Another important part that was, clearly brought to attention because of feminist political ecology was thinking about the poisoning of water by the use of pesticides as another strategy for land grabbing. So even though a lot of the literature on land grabbing was paying attention to land deals, to a lot of the hectares that were being grabbed in Africa, in different places in South America, I was more interested in the day-to-day grabbing, how people were losing the capacity to live lives with dignity, to live lives that are lived, joyfully, because of the conditions of the plantations. So thinking also how many of these communities managed to survive within the plantation, living, in between, in the interstices of the plantation. And I found that, many of those questions were answered by the work of women. A lot of what women and children do, from go to fetch the water, tending the gardens, tending to the sick, was really what kept this community surviving in the middle of the conditions that the plantation imposed. So I started to pay more and more attention to these spaces, and again, to ordinary forms of violence and ordinary geographies of care, and how the everyday, which is, of course, one of the feminist premises, that you study what is taken as banal, what is taken as not important, what is taken as private, what is taken as just ordinary everyday stuff, became very important for me. So these spaces of socialization, the spaces for taking care of others, for sustaining life, started to have a stronger presence for me, thinking about these landscapes of expropriation and environmental destruction. Yes, I started to think about dispossession beyond property laws, and thinking about the articulations with inequality and violence, how they played out in this reconfiguration of the space. To think about dispossession also as an everyday material, concrete project that resulted in the community's impossibility to sustain their life. And how what I saw was a lot of the organizing of the women, or of the labor of the women, as essential practices for recommoning certain spaces, certain relations, for sustaining life when everything is against it. I mentioned already this a little bit, but yes, thinking about these spaces from a feminist perspective meant paying attention to social reproduction, to the reappropriation of bodies, spaces, practices, and work mainly from women, thinking about also how this matters, women's and children's matters, sometimes are invisible to the state, are not important for the market. NGOs, social movements don't really pay attention to them. So the fact that children are getting sick from, using the water that comes as a drift from the plantations is seen as a non-issue. There are more important issues. So thinking with Cindy Katz, one feminist geographer whose work has informed a lot of mine, I'm always thinking about those geographies, the daily geographies, and how they are, excuse me, situated and embodied. And thinking about gender as a very important element in the assemblage of these, in how these landscapes are assembled, how they come into being, is really based on these projects, again, of militarization, of control of nature, of productivism, to make land work for capitalist accumulation. So how gender to me became then a way in which extractivism was really not only justified and legitimized, but how it depends on gendered relations in order to work. You need the gleaners. The women gleaners are essential because they pick up the fruit, what is left, make money out of waste and enable capital accumulation from waste. So seeing them as lesser work, less important work, is also part of how the plantation works. And again, care work as one part of social reproduction became a very important aspect of my work. And then I started then following what people do to defend water, what they do to defend territory, to defend their own culture, their own livelihoods from all of these dynamics, violent dynamics. I wanted to mention a little bit about the methods, because I think that sometimes the method discussion is left outside or sidelined. And I think methods are very important. If you're doing feminist work, if you're doing ecofeminist work, then it requires ecofeminist methods. It requires other methods. And to me, collaboration has been a very important aspect. How research has also this transformative potential of doing memory, of telling the story of a place in different ways, of helping, well, not helping, but working for, almost like working for a given community. And how you can create spaces of co-learning. It's not like you're teaching anything or just extracting knowledge. It is how we generate dynamics and spaces of co-learning. And for me, an ethics of care became central for doing research. These are some examples, mapping mapping the space of the home and the plot and the plantation, how they are intertwined, mapping historically the transformations of a given territory, doing maps also with embroidery, paying a lot of attention to the body territory. And this is a methodology that I take from the Colectivo de Miradas Críticas, which is a Latin American collective that I am part of, who has been working for many years now on these connections between the body and the territory, how they cannot be taken apart, thinking with indigenous communitarian feminists like Lorena Cabnal and Delmitania Cruz. And I think this embroidery reflects very well the multiple regimes of death, the multiple impositions of death, as Francia Marquez says, in a way that shows how the river, this is a map of a river, how the bodies and the territories, how they are transformed, how they suffer, you know, the disruption of life from these different forms of violence. Using also other languages, so embroidery as mapping and mapping as embroidery, but also comics and, you know, using, yes, the graphic language and following everyday life implied also following food. And then we did not just a graphic novel, but we did a cookbook. Maybe I can tell you more about that, but just to show you a little bit of how different methods. So all of this work has given me the opportunity to think what feminist political ecology is in Latin America, how ecofeminism is also, I would say, part of feminist political ecology. And I started thinking about where does these ideas come from. And there's, of course, this long history of land struggles. There's also the school of dependency theory, thinking about centers and peripheries is a very important part of Latin American critical thinking, but also social movements. The descolonial, la crítica descolonial, so the critique that is decolonial, but there's also, you know, a division between the decolonial school of thought and the descolonial, which is more inspired by Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui and other communitarian feminists and indigenous feminists in Latin America who think, you know, the need for doing anti-colonial work and thinking critically from a feminist perspective, not just, you know, a masculinist take on what colonialism is, but thinking with indigenous feminisms, indigenous forms of thought, and putting gender at the center. Ecofeminism, oh, it's misspelled, sorry. Oh no, it is okay. Ecofeminism, also an important source of these critiques. A lot of the work that has been done recently, well, for the last 2 decades on sacrifice zones, on toxic legacies in different environments, the idea of environmental suffering, which is also part of you know, a Latin American tradition. And of course, it is different in different regions. You cannot say that, you know, of course, there are different trajectories of thought that are specific to, let's say, Chile, let's say, Uruguay, to thinking Guatemala, to thinking about Venezuelan political ecologies. But these are, you know, I would say the commonalities that I've found in all of this work. A very important critique to extractivism and attention to care work, a lot of autonomous movements and thinking about autonomy and how land becomes attached to that project of autonomy. And of course, a super strong tradition of food sovereignty and agroecology that is very powerful because it is also about these large structures and the incredible movements for sexual and reproductive justice that you've seen as the Marea Verde, so the green ocean, as we call it, and a lot of the struggles against feminicide, which continue to be essential in different Latin American countries. So thinkers, very important thinkers that have informed political ecology in Latin America, feminist political ecology in particular. Berta Cáceres, of course. One of her quotes is, "As long as we have capitalism, this system will not be saved because capitalism is the contrary of life, ecology, human beings, and women." So always thinking about, you know, this master model of domination and how it is not only the control of nature what is at stake, but also the control of women. And of course, she's thinking about capitalism as against this project of putting life at the center. Francia Marquez, again, I think for me it has been super important, this idea of the politics of death, and how she has always stated that we need to birth life, like against all of these impositions of the politics of death. There is the necessity to protect life, to defend life, and to put life again at the center. Adriana Guzman, another very important communitarian feminist from Bolivia. And Adriana Guzman is one of those very important experts, I would say, in patriarchy. And she says patriarchy is the system that sustains violence against humanity and nature. So again, you see how there's a close dialogue with ecofeminists, different schools of thought, and how it has informed Latin American critiques. So I think of Latin American feminist political ecology mostly as a very loose field. I want to think about it in terms of invitation and not in terms of property or territory, as I think that sometimes academia has that. For me, it is not even that things have to be named as feminist political ecology in order to be included to the canon of feminist political ecology. For me, it is more interesting to trace those convergences when people are thinking in feminist terms and are thinking in environmental terms. When those two things converge, for me, I find an incredible political force in those connections. And I've seen them more and more, again, since the late 90s, I think in hand with all the mobilizations in Latin America for the defense of rivers, of jungles, of páramos, which are moorlands, of different ecosystems, and how feminism has informed a lot of these struggles. And you know, I showed the examples of Francia Márquez and Berta Cáceres, but one could think about Betty Cariño in Mexico, Juana Carfuna in Chile, Máxima Cuña in Peru, Mariel Franco in Brazil. There are so many examples of these kinds of struggles and how they have become embodied by women and women environmental leaders, that I think is very important to think about that. Also, how a lot of environmental movements, for example, movements for the defense of mangroves in a city like Cartagena in the Colombian Caribbean, are articulated with queer struggles. So there is a very big feminist impulse, even when a lot of people don't, a lot of these social leaders and environmental leaders don't necessarily consider themselves feminist. They don't name it as feminism. And this is something that has been very clear by Francia Marquez. She made it clear. She's like, sometimes I don't feel comfortable with white feminism from the cities. But of course, when she reflects about, you know, what is the essence of her fight against mining, large-scale mining, her fight in the defense of Black territories, her fight for peace, she articulates this in terms of feminism. And I think this is a very important point, because there is a lot of critiques that are coming from different forms of feminism. So in Latin America, you find the Black feminisms, which also have different ways of articulating. You have the Caribbean feminisms or the Quilombola feminisms in Brazil. But you have also communitarian, popular feminisms, indigenous and peasant feminisms. There are many ways in which the critique to liberal understandings of feminism, how it has taken place in the last years in Latin America. So I want to understand Latin American feminist political ecology as a commitment that is constantly under construction. So it is a project, it is not finished, for better understanding and transforming the power relations that shape current processes of the production of nature. And of course, they are based, you know, on long trajectories. So again, thinking about colonialism, racism is very important to these movements. And these power relations are understood as as not isolated. So it's not like feminist political ecologists in Latin America think of gender as an all-encompassing category, but they understand the cohesive role that gender has in bringing together these different matrices of domination. So it is thinking about class, about race, about age, about ableness, about sexuality all the time. And that to me is also something that I find very powerful and very inspiring. And then again, I'm not that interested in what counts as feminist political ecology in the journals and the books, but I'm more interested in seeing how feminist political ecology happens in the streets, in the mobilizations that we see for protecting certain ecosystems, for defending reproductive rights, connecting that with an anti-plantation, anti-pesticide struggle. How those connections happens to me are very important, and they don't happen within, not necessarily happen within institutions. This is knowledge that you need to trace, not just within academia. So again, it is informed by these different perspectives and also by collective forms of struggle and resistance. And it is more than a simple academic tool. I see it as a movement that has points that, of course, is very diverse. It's not that it is homogeneous, but that has these confluences around the idea of protecting life. And then, thinking about methods, how the methods then have to reflect that feminism that it is present in the content. It's not like content and form can be separated, or the result can be separated from the process. So it is thinking with dignity, with empathy, with solidarity, with care, with mutual respect, and not simply extracting. With these approaches, we think to nurture a political project that disrupts the violence imposed by cis heteropatriarchy on everyday life. And I use here the we because some of the things that I've been able to do is to tweak and work on these definitions of feminist political ecology as I have been in conversations with different students in universities in Latin America, in Mexico, in Costa Rica, in Peru, in Chile, and of course in Colombia, in Uruguay, how to think about this definition. It is almost as an apuesta. We say that in Spanish, like a bet, like an effort that we are going for that is unfinished, of the collective construction of other geographies, other natures, and this idea that is so powerful in Latin American thinking with Raquel Gutierrez Aguilar and others of doing in common. How do we make things in common? And some elements of what I've been seeing of this commitment are the question about body territory that I already mentioned, these relational forms of environmental, but not just environmental justice, how thinking about justice implies thinking about race, ethnicity, sexuality, reproductive justice, gender justice, food justice, and how all of these articulate also in relation to climate justice. I will leave it there because I think, maybe the conversation and the comments is what is more interesting to me. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity of sharing a little bit more of my work.
Thank you so very much, Diana. That was very inspiring and very rich. And also, I believe it resonated with quite a lot of discussion points we had this morning, and I hope that it also, enriches many of them. So I was wondering if there's maybe any questions that people might have for Diana. So there's one question at the back, and while Susanne is carrying the microphone, let me maybe very quickly, well, if you want, maybe also after that, I was very intrigued also because actually it's interesting that the German ecofeminist Maria Mies actually got into a huge fight with academic feminism about her project of building a feminist methodology, which she elaborated around a project of houses for battered women. And so that was a huge topic in German feminist theory. So I'm very curious to hear a little bit more if you want to say a little bit more also. I mean, you already very quickly informed us about this idea of ecofeminist methods. So I would be interested to hear more about it, but maybe let's also first hear about Christine Löw's question. I turn you around so you can maybe see her at the back of the... I don't know if you can see her, she's very far away. Maybe if you stand up, Christine.
Very tiny. Thank you.
You have to push the button on the microphone, Christina.
Like this? Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation you gave. It was very rich, and I am very much interested in using the political and analytical concept of extractivism to critique and maybe overthrow all this climate politics that's going on in the global north right now, like electric cars, blah, 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 all this lithium dispossession. And so I was wondering, the literature so far says gendered relations or more social gender inequality is an effect of extractivism, and you say it's constitutive gender relations for extractivism, and I would be interested to hear about that. Maybe you could elaborate the history of gendered capitalist neocolonialism in, like, where you work in Colombia. I work on India, and I could also say something on that about indigenous women there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. It's a very, very important one. I think it has different parts. So one part is how to understand extractivism. And for me, I see that this has been a concept that has been widely used by a lot of social movements. So I'm more interested in its political use than it is in its own analytical force. I think that analytically sometimes when you're reading about extractivism, you're reading about capitalism. You could replace even the word and say, oh, okay, this is about capitalism, how capitalism has zero respect for life, how it is incompatible with life. This idea of a collective life that is worth living, not a life in the sense of making live and living as an obligation or something like that. But for me, the political strength of extractivism merits taking it seriously. And for me, the way in which I define it is as a specific arrangement between production and reproduction, where reproduction is not being possible. So what I've seen as in this context of oil palm plantations is that these people who before were able to make a living in very precarious conditions, but they were able to make a living, for example, in the rice plantations under hacienda systems, do not even have those basic needs covered in the new plantations of oil palm. So I'm thinking with a lot of the women in this region of the Colombian Caribbean that they said, well, nobody eats from the oil palm. You know, like you cannot eat from the oil palm before picking up the leftovers from the rice harvest gave you at least a meal, but not the oil palm plantation doesn't even give you that. So that point of pushing even further the impossibility to guarantee social reproduction, I think is what I start calling extractivism. So that is, you know, an idea, and of course it has been defined differently by different people. But for me, its use is more political than analytical. And when I use it as a tool as an entry point for thinking about social reproduction. And what you mentioned about climate fault solutions, absolutely, how precisely the extraction is not up for debate. It's like, yes, we need electric cars and solar panels, but nobody wants to discuss where the water is coming from, where the land is coming from, what happens with labor arrangements. That is kind of left out. And as you say, I think that gender is constitutive of extractive projects, but it is also resulting from these extractive projects, exactly as you say. One of the big consequences of these big projects when they arrive to territories, the even further deterioration of the lived realities, mostly of women, children, elderly, but also of other feminized subjects. So a lot of queer people, a lot of migrants, of people who enter, within this subvaloration, this feminization that gender does, that is accentuated with extractivism. Delmitania Cruz Hernandez, Delmitania Cruz, she has thought about that in terms of what she calls the repatriarchalization of territories, how there is probably other forms of patriarchy that are happening in a community, but when you have the mine arrive, when you have the big plantation getting into the territory, when you have the narcos coming to your territory, one of the immediate things that start to happen is how gender-based violence rockets. And I think this is true for other disruptions in the environment. So definitely climate change, when that has been widely documented. Farhana Sultana, for example, Farhana Sultana has written about this, how with the pressures, the environmental pressures that climate change is producing, you see immediately more violence against women and children. When you see the mine arriving, you see more dependency on the wage earner, who happens to be the man, and you see how it rockets, gender-based violence rockets. The same with sexual violence, how sexual violence is fundamental for land grabbing, and it is not documented as such. Sometimes, it is documented, yes, war happens and women's bodies are part of the loot. So, of course, there's a lot of literature on that, but not necessarily thinking about how land grabbing happens through sexual violence. So making those connections for me is very interesting. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. And maybe if you want to say something about you're not obliged, but about the ecofeminist methodologies.
Yes, thank you so much. That for me is a very important question. And I think it's part of the feminist method to think about methods, because I think that how we're taught, and I'm speaking, in Latin America mostly, but I say that also, a lot of the education in doctoral programs is about the results. You have to show the results. It doesn't matter what happens, what happens in the field, almost like it stays in the field. We want to see your results and not the process. So thinking about the methods, thinking carefully about the process, I think it's part of a feminist understanding of doing research, and how it has to be based on an ethics of care in a way that is more transparent, in a way that it is up for debate as well. Yes, you need to have the difficult conversations whenever you are doing research with a given group, with people. When people are participating in your project, that is a relation, and a relation needs consent, needs reciprocity, needs to be all the time reviewed for expectations. All the time it has to be in conversation. And there's also a lot of violence hidden in the idea that in the idea of rapport. When you have to do ethnography, people have to become your friends and your informants. And once you have the stories from women in the field or other feminized subjects, or people who are neurodivergent, people who got sick in the field, people who during their research have to, suffered all forms of sexual harassment, then you start thinking, okay, we need to do science that is not patriarchal. How to do science that is counter the masculinist idea that the end justifies the means. And that for me has become, in my own work, criticizing the university, how the university reproduces certain hierarchies, how the university produces impunity, how it gets away with things that you can even believe because it is so ingrained within what we assume that is knowledge production. So, of course, we have easy examples to go to, but I think the most recent one has been Boaventura Sousa Santos, and how difficult it is for people to assume, to realize that you cannot separate the master and the work, that the work has been made good and has been made famous and has been made capitalized in many ways and commodified in many ways because of the abuse of power, because of how many women, not just women, of course, non-binary people, trans people, disabled people, how they have been kicked out of academia. So academia leaves a long trail of corpses. When people say, yes, we stand on the shoulders of giants, no, we stand on a trail of corpses. So recognizing that, I think, is super important. So questioning from the beginning, the kinds of work that we do, from the different things that are implicated in what we do, I think is super, super important. I didn't know that about Maria Mies, so thank you for telling me that story. That is super interesting. And yeah.
It was at the moment of institutionalization of feminist and gender studies in Germany, and she brought in the paradigm, like several paradigms, I think 6, and one of which was partiality. Can you say that in English? Like she requested feminist research to be partial and not to buy into the supposedly objectivity of science, but I think she even quoted, if my memory is correct, Mao, saying you need to bite into the pear if you want to know its taste. I found that kind of funny. Are there any other questions for Diana? I have like 100, but please.
Thank you.
So there's one over there.
Hi. I was wondering if you can tell us more about the Colectivo de las Miradas Críticas you mentioned during your, I don't know how to say it, presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thank you. It is called Colectivo de Miradas Críticas desde el Territorio. So, Collective of Feminist Critical Views from the Territory. That is a weird translation, but that would be the idea. It is a collective that was formed almost 10 years ago, and it includes women from different parts of Latin America. Not all, of course. Latin America is also, a space under construction and a political construct, of course. But we are from Peru, Mexico, Ecuador, Uruguay, I think, and Colombia, Brazil. I think that's us. And we've been thinking about bodies and territories, how to think about those two entangled in a way that the harm that is produced to a territory is also harm produced to the body. And I think one of the interesting things that the Colectivo has done is this mapping of bodies and territories and realizing how centering women's experience of these environmental transformations, of these different projects, really opens different ways of understanding different forms of violence, but also different forms of resistance, how they understand, the violence that is imposed over territories and bodies in a specific historical moment, in a place, and how they understand also the need for organizing, for supporting the community, for doing political work that is not necessarily the one that we recognize as political. So it's not necessarily the big assembly or the lawsuit, like classic masculinist way of politics, but they see it based in their gardens, in the possibility of doing a lot of the dealing with trauma, for example, trauma as a very important collective issue. So it's not what happened to you is your own thing and it's your own fault, and pain is not, and pain and harm are not privatized. They are collective issues. So how to deal collectively with these transformations and these forms of violence, and not just individually. And that has been very, very powerful for us to understand how women are water defenders, how they have contributed to land reclamation projects and land occupation projects and environmental restoration. My most recent work is about these women who are mangrove planters. And they have been doing reforestation in a big, important wetland in the north of Colombia. Amazing work, just on their own, with very little resources, with very little support. So in a sense, the methodology is to open up your idea of what counts as the politics, what counts as political, what counts as revolutionary as well, and think about it from an anti-patriarchal science way, from a feminist perspective.
Thank you, Diana. Are there any other questions? Here's another one.
Yes, so thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting, and I was interested in your methodology and how this is shaped by sensory experiences. So you were speaking about the embroidery of mapping or a cookbook and how you deal with this, and then translating that again into academic work. This dealing with the senses, the haptic, the visual. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I think sometimes it is not really about translating it to academic work. Sometimes it is different. Sometimes it is inspired by academic work, but it is something else that travels in a different way. For me, it has came from the need to use different languages, different channels, different ways of communicating things. For example, the comic book really allowed me to reflect on the silences. When we were doing a lot of the mapping, the participatory counter mapping, there were a lot of moments of, just silence and just people going through painful memories of loss. And it is difficult to describe that silence from an academic language. Like if you're writing your paper, I don't know, for me it was really hard to say, everybody was quiet. And the moment of silence was so painful. And it was a collective moment for dealing with loss. But in a comic book, you can do that. A graphic novel gives you the possibility. So we used an image of one of the community members closing the marker, and the face, you can see that everything shatters inside him. So having that possibility of using other languages was very important for me. But as you say, there is the need also to decenter, I would say, the eye, like a lot of one of the marks, one of the characteristics of masculinist patriarchal science is the eye, is this idea that you can do participant observation, and observation is the most important thing. And even if they don't see you, it's even better. So if you can do that kind of peeping into the life of people, that is even good. And to change it for what feminists have think of as more like an ear. So the feminist ear is an idea that I take from Sara Ahmed. And Sara Ahmed says that a feminist principle for doing research is really about listening, and listening seriously, like taking seriously what other people think is stupid, what other people think it doesn't matter. And as I mentioned, sometimes it is the state that thinks that you don't matter, but sometimes it is even the social movement that you're part of, the organization that you have given your life to, that thinks that you getting sick is your own fault, that doesn't matter, that children are getting sick, that is not a big deal to bring up to the organization. So I think that the feminist year is a very important one. So definitely listening. And there has been a lot of ethnographies now that are using more the sensorial, as you mentioned, and thinking with all the senses. So smell and taste and doing ethnography from those senses. And that is something that I haven't necessarily done in my research. Like I haven't reflected on that carefully. But of course, I found it in my work. Food is absolutely essential for community survival, for them thriving. What the memories that food materializes, all the historical legacies of resistance, all of that comes together in a simple dish. So I'm always interested in food, also because I love cooking. I consider myself a cook, and for me, it is super important to see what people consider food, how they define food, the relations that are materialized in their dishes, how they change through time. So the cookbook that we did was inspired by that, how with one dish you could tell a story of a territory, a given territory. One example of the recipes that we included, and I will finish with the example, is a fish stew that was very important for this community in the Colombian Caribbean, and they stopped eating it, and they start replacing the local fish with canned tuna coming from who knows where, and that was really weird. So we started asking, and this is Alejandro Camargo's research. He starts asking, like, why are you eating canned tuna instead of the local fish that is available there? And the story was that with the arrival of a mine, a lot of people who were opposing the mine were being assassinated by the paramilitary groups, and the bodies were thrown to the river. So people didn't want to eat fish from the river because the river was traveling, with so much pain and violence and literal bodies that they didn't want to touch that fish anymore. So that is a very gruesome and sad example of what a dish is and how it can change. But if you ask about the food, I think you can find very important information about the history of a place, about the ecologies that sustain that place, about the environmental structures and environmental functions that are being changed, that have changed or have been eroded in different ways or affected. So I think it is a very important thing, to pay attention to those things that are not considered as important.
Thank you very much, Diana. I think that is what feminist politics have always been about, right? To question what counts as political, what is a political praxis, we've had debates this morning also about what is a antagonistic or transformative style of politics and so on, so it really actually reflects a lot. We have another question back there. I will turn you around again.
Thank you very much for your great talk. I wanted to ask you, you said that they didn't take the word feminist to speak about themselves or what they did. And I was wondering what exactly were the words they used, or were they speaking more about activities, like food activity? And what was the vocabulary? Because from my perspective, subsistence perspective from Miami, I would say that they suffer from an anti-subsistence war, an anti-subsistence system, because if we don't want to use capitalist words, let's reverse it and let's define capitalism in speaking about subsistence. So it's not capitalism; it's anti-subsistence system. But what are their words to qualify this thing they suffer from?
Yes, thank you for that question and for your comment, Cornelia. I think that is a very important discussion, not just antagonistic and transforming politics, but thinking also about what justice means in feminist terms. It has been huge in Colombia because of the process of the peace process and transitional justice. A lot of the things that came from women's movements and feminist movements in the country is the need for going for, not reproducing punitive justice and thinking about restorative justice. So that has been a super important debate in Colombia recently as we go through the transition. I could say much more about that process, but the transition to peace has involved also the discussion about what is justice for feminism. And about your very important question, they would say, well, I'm not feminist, but I think that women don't have the same opportunities as men, and women, for example, don't have access to land. I'm not feminist, but I believe in reproductive justice. I won't call myself feminist, but when they describe what they think, what they struggle for, what they have devoted their lives for, when they spell it out, it's about feminism. It's about sustaining, and they use a lot the language of sustaining life and putting life at the center. So that's why I make the parallel with social reproduction, how social reproduction becomes this important arena for struggle. So you could see a lot of very sophisticated understandings of an ethics of care, of an anti-patriarchal way of being in the world, but they don't feel comfortable naming themselves feminist because they think feminism is something that is reserved for white women from the global north. And I think, or for from urban settings, coming to the more rural spaces. Or the same with a lot of the queer movements, that they don't necessarily call themselves queer or feminist, but they believe in many of the key elements against a cis heteropatriarchy norm. So I think that even if they don't consider themselves as part of these more academic terms, the work that they're doing really spells out what feminism, what queer movements, what environmentalism is. And environmentalism is another word that is not easily used, because ecologism either, ecologismo and ambientalismo are also seen as imposed from outside. And for example, in the case of Tayrona National Park, a lot of the people were displaced in the name of conservation. So they don't feel comfortable with saying, I'm an environmentalist, not necessarily, but when you listen to their struggles, they would say, yes, I'm a forest defender, I'm a mountain defender, I'm the defender of the river, I'm a guardian of the river, I'm a guardian of the jungle. The wilderness, which is also a space that is, that they don't use wilderness as the word wilderness, or they don't define a marsh or a water body. They don't name it a wetland, because they feel like those words are already taken by NGOs, by the state, by colonial and racist forms of environmental defense. But when you listen to what they do, when you analyze what they do, I feel like, okay, I can name that, a feminist political ecology perspective. I can name that an environmentalist perspective or a feminist perspective, even when they're not using those words, because they feel like they are being imposed from outside as well. So
yeah,
yes,
and I think it's so important to be careful to words and actions, because we've like earlier had like talks on far right politics, and they start to all the time use the word feminism now. Many of them are supposedly feminist now, the far right in Europe, saying that they have to kick out migrants and Muslims because they protect the European woman. And when you look at what they actually do, it's not feminist at all. They never do anything for women everywhere at all. So I think it's maybe we are in a phase also where it's very important to look at words, but also look at actions. I agree with you so much on that.
Yeah, and I think that happens a lot. Like, we're doing this in the name of women. Remember when Bush Jr. decided to invade Afghanistan? It was to save Afghan women.
Exactly.
They militarized the border with Mexico because they needed to save Mexican women. It's like, it is never about the women.
It's never about the women. So let's look at the actions too, right? Are there any other questions? I might profit from that situation to ask another, like, I'm absolutely abusing of my position as a moderator.
I'm happy to have this conversation. Thank you for engaging so generously.
No, but I just maybe because we've been speaking about also political strategies, and I've been very interested because at some point you've been speaking about Latin American feminist political ecologies, and like one question would a little bit be like whether you think that is somehow, like speaking about terminology, an alternative to ecofeminism for you in a way, or if it's just another way of saying the same thing. And that kind of points to a more practical question about global ecofeminist strategies. So you've been speaking about Tayrona Park, and just a little bit further on that same coast, you have the Guajira, where the German Green Party, that is famous for their feminist foreign politics, have made that, they are at the government in Germany now, and they've made this deal to buy coal from that region, as you probably know, and then to destroy an entire village of, I believe, Wayu people that has to be moved away so that the Germans can get their coal. And I believe there has been like also some ecological solidarities, and people from ecological movements in Germany have been trying to reach out to the communities and try and set up some strategies. But yeah, I would be interested in like what are possibilities to build like, obviously there needs to be also local implications, but obviously as the extractivism is also an international form of capitalist economy, and what do you think about how to build international, transnational, feminist, ecofeminist solidarities? On what basis, or where do you find nice examples where this works actually? Or do you also have maybe some criticism about places where you think it didn't work well? Or yeah, I would be interested in your view about that.
Yes, and thank you for the question about, more precision. I think that feminist political ecology for me is that convergence between certain forms of feminism and certain forms of environmentalism. And I think that one very important trajectory of thought has been ecofeminism, but it's not the only one, because I also see a lot of dependency theory, for example, in those conversations. I also see a lot of the agroecology. So you see different critiques and how they nurture these convergences that, again, I see in academic terms, but it is more also what I'm seeing in terms of the political formations and social movements and the political mobilizations in Latin America. If you think about, the big mobilization of 2021 in Colombia, or if you think about Chile, like there's a lot of that conversation. So I think that ecofeminism informs these convergences. But of course, that is problematic because we can think that, feminist political ecology is bigger and then ecofeminism is smaller, and that is not true. It's different forms of thinking about similar issues, I would say. And a lot of my own education, but also a lot of what people read in Latin America is Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva. Those are two super important ecofeminist thinkers for Latin American social movements and academia. And I would say maybe also Alicia Puleo would be the other one, like thinking with ecofeminisms, less about other ecofeminisms, but I think that is very important. And absolutely what you're saying, this is about international solidarity, about thinking together. Is impossible for us to separate spaces in that way, or the struggles in a way that we don't think they are the same struggle. And yes, the Green Party has a super important presence in Colombia through the Ball Foundation. Is a very important source, of support for ecological projects, for thinking about women and even, queer perspectives. You even have to do the checklist. Like, did you include women? Did women talk or not? You have to go through the requisites in order to do a project. But as you say, it is full of contradictions, because sometimes, yes, it is still seen that the global South is the provider of resources. It is the provider of bodies and of water and of land and of energy and whatever needs to be taken from it. So a lot of it has to do with doing anti-colonial work and building solidarity across difference and across distance. Which is, of course, something that women and feminist thinkers have done forever. So I think there's a long tradition for that, and yes, a very important task for all of us, how to think about this in more international terms.
Thank you so much. Is there any further question? Don't be shy. There's one more. Maybe if there's any other, we can also collect them. No, okay.
Does it work? Yeah, okay. Thank you for your very interesting talk. I have a question about this very tricky question of anti-extractivist struggles in the age of climate change and decarbonization. So on the one hand, with the green transition and capitalist modernization, green capitalist modernization in the US and China and Europe, there's this new burden on mines and the global south, and this scrabble on critical minerals, etc. So basically, this would be the pledge for intensifying anti-extractivist struggles. And on the other hand, one could also, on the other hand, I see that there's a problem and a sort of dilemma, because totally unrestricted rapid climate change could be eventually maybe even worse than a certain extractivist environmental harm, even for indigenous self-determination. And yeah, so I know this is a very tricky question and there's no straightforward answer to that, but I think it's still worth a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I think that, we have been pushed to believe throughout our life, and this is true, historically, that you have to choose. You have to choose if you want to choose the women's cause or the labor cause. And those two are antagonistic. And even if, when you do feminist claims, you are accused of dividing the movement, of attacking the cause. And this replicates, when you speak about racism within different spaces, it's like, oh no, you are dividing us. You have to choose. You can be anti-racist or you can be a feminist. You can be anti-capitalist or you can be environmentalist. And I think that is a false choice. And I think that we have to go for all, of course, because again, there is this common logic that is so important for ecofeminism, that has been revealed by ecofeminism, that is, this impetus for the control of nature, this masculinist view of the master, all of that really has horrible consequences for everybody. And if you want to undo capitalism, you have to undo patriarchy. And if you want to undo patriarchy, you have to undo transphobia. Like, it's not about picking, it's about a common battle that has all of these different manifestations. And of course, that is not necessarily what you have to do in your own personal life. We can have other conversations about that. We cannot fight all the fights at the same time. I mean, personally, but collectively, we need the clarity that we need to undo all of these regimes. And I think that there has been yes, like the false idea that extractivism is necessary, that some forms of extractivism are necessary, that we cannot move away from extractivism. And that has been super powerful and damaging. That is I think, a very perverse way of seeing some people as collateral damage. So does that mean that we have to go against electric cars? Not necessarily, but we have to know that they are simply a little moment of transition that we can accept, because what we want is to actually dismantle a whole system under which you need a car in order to survive, in order to eat, in order to travel, you need a car. Like, the point is to make cars obsolete. So it's not about choosing the less damaging car, it's about making cars something that is really not acceptable. And I chose the car, just for any example, but the whole point is to really open the political imagination and to create other forms of common sense that are, of course, counter-hegemonic, that like, stop the convincing that we need to either choose one cause or the other. Like, we need everything. We need to really transform everything. And to me, that sounds, of course, like a lot of work, and sounds like almost you get paralyzed when you listen to that. And of course, it is daunting, but at the same time, we know the solutions. We have seen them so many times that really we don't need to do it in a way that is serving the purposes of capitalism. And we have incredible examples. Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, a lot of communities started to fight for their own energy sovereignty. And a lot of them use solar panels, but in a way that is not compliant with capitalism, and that is at a different scale, that prioritizes some specific uses for that energy. So definitely medical conditions and that kind of energy. So what I think that has to change is the idea that extractivism is necessary. I think that is what needs to be questioned. And it is so prevalent, and from different governments from the left in Latin America, that was the point. You have examples from Ecuador, from Bolivia, that is, no, we need the mines. We need them because this is a common good. This is for the public good. But then, you cannot justify the violence that comes with them. So I think that we have to do some work in also thinking, in better understanding these logics of extractivism as needed, as necessary.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. And also maybe it's just not an either-or question in a way. I believe for Rojava, there's right now also a solidarity campaign to build solar panels in Rojava, and I think that doesn't mean that they believe into green capitalism. It's just about finding solutions. Diana, do you still have patience for a last question? Because you've been
Sure, absolutely. So I will have to run to another meeting after this question. That's
okay, so I will ask Christina to be quick as she can. You raised your hand, right, Christina? Maybe you can take the microphone, and then we're gonna let you be because it has been really rich.
I have just a very brief question. So you spoke about from the struggles for life. So I was wondering, what do communitarian, peasant, indigenous feminisms or women's group propose? Because in India they really work with the concept of food sovereignty, because it is so strong, and you connected it to the women who could hardly survive. And in India you could also see there are studies that people are living on 1,400 calories a day now. They are forced to from 2000, so this is really life-threatening. And so I was wondering, what do the communities or the struggles there propose? Because life is also a very big concept. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. And it is different for different communities. It also changes. So what I'm identifying is, this point of convergence, but of course it is different for different communities. One example that I think is useful is comes, from Afro-Colombian communities in the Pacific. And Francia Marquez has explained this under the principle of I am because you are. So they believe clearly in interdependence and in this idea of collective life. It's not life for some, it's life for everybody. And they use the idea of vivir sabroso, which is living joyfully, living deliciously, like living well, but not just buen vivir. It is also living in a way that is enjoyable. And that is one specific form of understanding what this fight for life is, what this idea of putting life at the center. And as you mentioned, food sovereignty is a big one. And with climate change, more and more, it is also fighting for land, where you have rising sea levels and coastal erosion and the destruction of mangroves and coral reefs. So land continues to be a very important one. But I would say that I agree with you. Food is one big one. And also a lot of Latin American countries and different women that I've been working with, for example, in the border between Guatemala and Mexico, they are really struggling for protecting themselves or defending themselves in certain way against narco violence, how, the path of illegal drugs in Latin America and the cartels really transform the lives of these communities. So most of their efforts are about these narco-capitalist formations and how to protect themselves. So it depends. I would say it depends for each community. But some of the principles are clearly there, clean water, soil, availability, the possibility to grow some of your food at least. And living without fear is one that is also huge. In Colombia, you see it articulated in different ways. And again, if you think with the idea of the imposition of politics of death, the alternative for Francia Marquez is living without fear. That's what you should be doing. That is a life that is worth living, a life without fear.
That's a very nice ending word.
True.
And horizon for so many politics, including feminist politics. Thank you so much, Diana. That was a very, very inspiring exchange, and that I hope will also resonate in all of our debates tomorrow when we go on with our conference. So yeah, I hope we will get more different and other occasions to keep this exchange going.
I hope so too. We will be in conversation for sure.
Yes.
Thank you so much again for the opportunity to discuss with you all, to think with you all about this.